Thank you everyone for coming along tonight. We have here for you an enormous panel and we're going to be tackling the subject art in the city. My name's Penny Modra and I'm a writer and editor. I've occasionally goodness, that's bad. I've occasionally written about art for The Age and the Sunday Age. And I'll introduce our other panellists as well. We have here, in no particular order, Oslo Davis. Oslo is a cartoonist who you probably know his work from his Overheard column, which comes out weekly in The Age. Oslo's also contributed to, I always forget whether it's the New York Times or the New Yorker. That's bad, isn't it?
Times.
The Times. Okay. The Guardian. He works for Readings. What else do you contribute to, Oslo?
Art Guide Australia.
Oh yes, and The Engine. Yeah, so you've no doubt seen Oslo's work whenever you pick up a publication in Melbourne. Next to Oslo we have Professor Paul Carter, who is a writer and an artist. He is Professor of Design Urbanism at RMIT University. He's also the head of his own design studio called Material Thinking, who most recently have delivered Alterations, a public artwork for Dandenong's new Civic Square. To the left of Paul, we have Emily Sexton, who is the director of Next Wave. And I know to call it Next Wave, but we might know it as the Next Wave Festival.
Both are fine.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Next Wave happens every 2 years. And Emily, prior to that, worked at Fringe Festival as creative producer for many years. And then on the far end, we have Tony Ellwood, who's the director of the National Gallery of Victoria. And he's also known as having been the director of the Queensland Art Gallery, which includes the Gallery of Modern Art up until June 2012. Tony was the brains behind the concept of the NGV's current exhibition, Melbourne Now, which is an enormous project, and I'm sure I don't need to outline its scale here. If you haven't seen it, it's continuing on until when? The end of March?
23rd of March.
23rd of March. So that's a very perfunctory introduction for everyone here, and I've used up probably half the time of the panel. We'll be talking for around 45 minutes, so please think of questions during that time, because we've got a full 15-minute Q&A at the end, and I think we'll be able to fit a lot of pointy questions in that period of time. We have a broad topic today, art and the city. We're going to try to get down to tin tacks as fast as we can. The way that Simon described this topic in the Wheeler Centre program was as a two-way artistic interaction, thinking about the relationship between the city and its artists, and vice versa, between artists and the city. We're going to look a lot at Melbourne, but we're also really interested in trying to speak globally and look at some trends. It's hard to start a topic this broad, but I think let's start by asking where everyone's coming from. The city relies on art and artists to some degree. A degree we'll obviously discuss further, but in turn, artists rely on the city. To start with, I want to ask the panel to describe how they see their role on this continuum. How do you see your role in this interaction, if you feel you have a role? Where are you coming from in this kind of exchange between the city and artists? Em, do you want to start?
Sure, Penny.
Yeah.
So I'm an artistic director of a festival for emerging artists, and I guess I've been doing it for 4 years, or coming up to 4 years, and over that time I've really come to understand what an artistic director does, and I think one of the real things that I do all the time is find patterns, and I observe ways that people are talking to each other that are changing, and I also introduce people to each other, and I create connections. I also find or try to create contexts that are appropriate for someone's idea. So I think about what an audience will need in order to really come at an artist's work with the most open mind and the most generosity and kind of curiosity, I guess. And sometimes the things that people need are to know how to get there. They need a good drink in their hand. They need to be fed, so that's all those things around art that really enable and support artists and their visions. I also, I guess, as an artistic director, I see a lot of work. I would probably see at least 2 to 4 shows a week, and I travel a lot. And I've been lucky in this job to travel a lot because Next Wave works nationally. We bring in emerging artists from all over the country, and recently we've sort of grown that international scope as well. So I guess I've also been in other cities. In last year, I was in sort of Montreal and Athens, and in that moment, you are experiencing art with, I guess, other like artists from elsewhere or artistic directors from elsewhere, and in those experiences, you're kind of enacting your values, I guess, and you're demonstrating yourself as someone who likes surprises or innovation or weird stuff, or to go to dark spaces and see weird things, and in that I'm becoming, I guess, I am an ambassador for Melbourne too, and for the kinds of things that people in Melbourne like as well. I come from a huge family of AFL crazies, so I guess, in that moment I'm also talking about weird sports that no one else likes but we like. So I guess it's both in my interaction with artists and in the way that I carry what is Melbourne about me beyond artists that I kind of see my role.
Okay, thanks, Em. Tony, you've been thinking there. What would you like? Where are you coming from?
Not quite sure.
What's your point, Tony?
We've got two big galleries that we have filled with a lot of artists that are not local and a lot of artists that are deceased. So we have to sort of work out where our game plan is when it comes to servicing a local community. A local community that's also hungry to be introduced to the rest of the world and also wants to be introduced and reintroduced to our historic collections. So it's that fine balance. So in a way, what we've done, both intuitively and strategically, is to break the gallery into components that enables us to work in an immediate and in an intuitive sense with, say, the studio space at Federation Square, which is that area on the very ground floor opposite the atrium. That's something that can have shows that might only be on for a month. Like we recently had a band, a collective of people that came together, did a soundtrack in September, and it helped to launch Melbourne Now. So it can be an incubator in that sense, or a facilitator. Then it can be more formal, where we're doing retrospectives this year for Emily Floyd, Robert Jacks, Inga King. We're also looking at ways in which we can merge contemporary living artists and local artists with Australian art history. So we're doing a big surrealist show next year, which will start around the 1940s, just on Australian surrealism, but bring it right up to the present. So it's also how you apply scholarship at both living and non-living artists within the same project. And then at St Kilda Road, which is, I think, a building that for many people has really informed so much of their practice. It's about where is Australian and living artists, where can they be relevant in that dialogue. So Melbourne Now was about trying to bring the two buildings together and say they're both owned by local arts audiences and they both have a right to be seen in there from time to time.
Right, thank you, Tony. We'll get more into that. I know everyone's got questions about this. Paul Carter, would you like to tell us where you're coming from?
I'm coming from West Melbourne, and and I cycle around quite a lot, and I go on the metro quite a lot. So that's sort of where I come from, I enjoy wandering around the city, and I enjoy the way in which a city can induce sociability. The way in which public spaces and the amenities of a shared public space can create opportunities for encounter, for inclusiveness. I very much like what Emily was saying about the director's role in relation to the artist, but of course for the rest of us who are not working between an institution and an artist, it's the artistic opportunities, the creative opportunities, which the choreography of the city itself brings into play, that are our everyday experience. So, maybe it sounds a little bit idealistic, but I'm excited by what the Germans call the dramaturgical possibilities of public space. What I mean by that is that you can see formations of crowds. You can see how the traffic lights are probably our biggest choreographic instrument, actually, currently, and they tend to sort of make us into a kind of staccato crowd. But you could imagine, I've always thought it'd be quite nice to have traffic lights that were sort of more intuitively programmed, so that we could start to create more interesting movements across the urban domain.
I love it.
I wanted to share that with you.
He's thinking Busby Berkeley, I think.
Yes, that's right. So I'm interested in, and what I suppose I write about, and when I assist with designs in the public domain, they could be permanent or they can be ephemeral, performative. I'm interested in how we sort of induce, as I say, gatherings and sometimes dispersals. But the underlying ambition of that is to encourage people to feel at home in their city. And that's not about being necessarily comfortable. Of course, it is about a degree of safety. But it's about subtle ways in which we can create almost an emotionally engaging signage, not the sort of signs that proliferate in the city just telling you how far it is to St Kilda or something, but much subtler indications. It's almost like we're scoring our own city. And of course the primary performers of the city are ourselves, the audience here. We are making the place continually reproduce itself and come alive. So that's what I mean by dramaturgy. Dramaturgy faces outwards towards an engagement with what is happening politically and socially and environmentally, and it finds strange ways to improvise social scores that we can all sign up to. That's the ambition.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, my Oslo.
Me? I don't know where I fit in this scheme of things, in the sense that, I mean, on one hand, I could possibly be regarded as the artist making art in a city, although I don't really have exhibitions and I don't... I'm not really into the contemporary art scene. It's not really something that I do. So, I've often thought about where I fit in the whole landscape of things when I'm sitting at home crying and looking at my desk. But I think at the end of the day, I'm a commentator or a reporter, or even the cartoonist in society is the fool in many ways, and we have some great fools who have drawn for the Age newspaper over the last 50 years or so, and so I guess I would like to be regarded, as one of those people who feed off the stupidness of people in the city and turn it into something in the newspaper where everyone knows how stupid they are, and they can realise that aren't people funny and aren't people crazy.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my job. I report, I somehow interpret, and then I present back to everyone.
What they're like.
Yeah. That's...
Thank you, Oslo. Right, there's a lot of starting points there, but I think perhaps let's start with Melbourne, because I'm sure it's one of our favourite topics, and probably among the audience one of the favourite topics. Can we talk about whether Melbourne is a good place to make art, and maybe a good place to look at it? And here I'm giving us a chance to speak in broad brushstrokes and terrible generalisations. Maybe just to give you confidence, I'll start off with my own generalisation. Although this is probably a nice one. When I worked as the editor of a city guide, and I worked with a network of other editors in other cities, I would say to them, well, do you want to run this event that's happening in Sydney? And they would say, no, it's not cool enough. Whereas I would definitely have commissioned a write-up of that equivalent event in Melbourne, because my idea was that in Melbourne we'll give people a first chance. Like we'll give everyone one go, even if it's the weirdest thing you've ever heard of. And you're probably thinking, oh, I'll just go and get a drink. But I think Melburnians are quite generous in that way, and they'll give everyone a chance. So I think that is a generalisation I can make about the city. You're from Sydney. Do you have any comparisons you'd like to make?
Well, certainly I found when I moved to Melbourne, and I was actually moving back, my family is from here, people were willing to give other people a chance, and it was open and collaborative in that way, and I was able to meet people in the arts community easily in a way that I would have found more difficult in Sydney. And that might just be because I grew up there, and I think sometimes your tracks get deepened in where you grow up. And you kind of see
very diverse, like geographically, isn't it?
It is. And I have this kind of dumb theory, and I really open to anyone to refute it, but I've always thought about the harbour is undeniable. It's so seductive and it's so beautiful, but it's also the centre of the city, and it's hard to ignore. And you can't gather on the harbour, right? You can gather around it, but you have to either be really wealthy or have a boat or a ferry, or you can't come together on the harbour. You can come together around it, and I think that really portions the city off into kind of 4 north, east, west, south tribes, whereas Melbourne brings people towards. You can not only can you see in Melbourne down a street really straight, you can see where you're going, but also people can come together into one place. Maybe they come to Fed Square. They certainly have done over time, but there is a point of there is an opportunity to gather in the city purely in its geography and layout, and. I don't know, I've always felt like the opportunity is there in a geographic sense.
Do you reckon it's cheaper? You can take a risk and do something maybe that everyone will hate, but perhaps that's changing. Tony, do you have a view on...
Well, I hear all the time from people, they say that they think Melbourne is the most supportive environment for artists with other artists. And I saw it firsthand with over 400 practitioners in Melbourne Now. Yeah. It was quite extraordinary how everyone was pulling for each other and making sure that they were okay, and sort of being positive even if you knew that wasn't particularly their generation or their particular interest. So I think that's something that artists have said to us all the time, that even a show like this would have been more difficult to mount in other cities within the time frame in which we did it, because everyone would be sort of, arguing more about their patch and how they're being presented and so on, whereas everyone here was collaborative, supportive, open-minded, prepared to take risks with us as well, which I think is another great characteristic of Melbourne. I think we don't take ourselves quite so seriously. We're prepared to take those sort of artistic challenges. That's my interpretation. Having lived in Brisbane for 5 years, it's definitely much more collaborative and creative than what I've experienced up north. The other thing is we have, I've always said, a disproportionate amount of commercial and artist-run spaces within our sort of urban sort of fringe. I've never counted that up, and it's based on no statistics. But my sense is, whenever I go to any other city, I don't see all those pop-up spaces, and I don't see that depth in commercial.
Right. Oslo, you seem to have a more cynical view of this. Why are you so cynical?
It's just in his nature.
I'm cynical, but I feel as though my cynicism is helpful.
Yes.
So
are we too serious?
Certainly. I mean, I think that there is this sort of Melbourne as a New York, or Melbourne as a Manhattan or a Brooklyn is something that I've been banging on for a while, and in many ways it's both a compliment and a kind of a piss take a little bit. We kind of think of ourselves as being the cool kid and cutting edge in art and things like that. So, and I think that's a good thing, but I always, as a humorist, I guess, I try to remind people to keep their enthusiasm in check and don't run away with it too far. I mean, if I may, I have some slides.
Yes, I would love. Let's have it. We might as well illustrate if we're going to talk about this.
Get this out of the way.
Yes.
So I did a drawing from Mianji called Melbhattan many years ago. And it basically recast the 5 boroughs of New York as suburbs of Melbourne. And this developed into an animation which I looked at Woody Allen's film Manhattan and did a Melbourne version, and I drew it in the overheard style that I do every week. So I copied all the 61 images from the start of his film.
And you found a Melbourne equivalent.
And I found a Melbourne equivalent.
Right.
So you might be able to recognise some of those buildings, but you also might remember the Woody Allen version of those people kissing on the balcony. But Melbourne is very New York, as we know, and everyone bangs on about, with this Upper West Side construction happening on our grid. And, you know, the Sojo and all those little things that people are coming up with. So I created this sort of homage. But for me, Overheard sort of connects with the city and sort of recasts us as this romantic kind of place. Whether it is or not, I'm not sure, but it's a pretty interesting kind of diverse place of old buildings that were once, you know, the city was one of the biggest cities in the world, and architecture reflects a lot that was happening overseas. So yeah, a lot of Overheards sort of plug into that. So these are a couple recently, which I think reflect the city a little bit. So the one here says, "No, mate, you'll have to go to Fitzroy for that sort of thing." And the other one, it's Costco, Janice, the wedding gift superstore.
Oh, this is my favourite.
But this is one I did for the Age. So it's a kind of a local philosophy. If you can't read it, if a Melbourne bike share bicycle tyre goes flat at Docklands, and there's no one there to ride it, does it really go flat? And the last couple I want to show is another sort of a dig at Docklands. Everyone talks about the Paris Street end of Collins Street. I think Docklands is the Geelong end of Collins Street, and this is out of date, but you know, we lived with this for a while. This construction. Oh, sorry, one more. And the Mikey, of course, and the road tolls. But I think the point, Penny...
You should do a performance. So we can laugh at ourselves. Look, we're doing it now.
Well, the point is, the reason I put these together for this presentation is that certainly Melbourne is a fantastic city, there's no doubt about it. But let's keep that in check and celebrate that it's the funny things about it as well.
Well, that kind of brings me to an area where we seem to take ourselves very seriously, and that's every time the Economist Quality of Living Survey is released, and also now the Monocle Livability Index, which we are dominating. Well, actually, we're dominating the... what is it called? The Economist... what is it called? Intelligence Unit. They do an annual livability survey. And Melbourne is currently listed on that as the most livable city in the world. We've beaten somewhere in Austria and somewhere in Canada. And we were in the top 10, and Sydney did not make it into the top 10 of Monocle's list last year. They were somewhere down at number 13. I think they dropped 2 places. Anyway, but we always seem to get very pompous and kind of excited about ourselves when these lists come out. And we do take that very seriously. But I thought having you just touched on a failing of ours, which is Docklands, that it may... I really would love to ask... Paul, about, I guess, how we use our public space to show art, how we use our public space for creative endeavour or activity, and do we actually do it well? We certainly think that we have a very functional city. I'd like to talk about how art or public art or even live art should feed into that sort of judgment of a city. And also whether we kind of do it.
Well, head on the block or something. Well, I don't particularly want to talk about Docklands, but what I would, I mean, Oslo's cartoons illustrate exactly the point, I suppose, that does come out of that, and that is that if you are going to talk about a dialogue between people who are creating new visions, new ways of inhabiting the city, and the way in which the city is in fact planned, then one measure of a city's cultural vitality is how effective the dialogue is. So simply to provide a number of indices about the volume of artistic activity which of course is not just confined to artistic activity, it's entrepreneurial activity, it's also all sorts of making activity, and not to be able to find a prominent translation of that into the improved amenity of the urban space, that's a problem. And that actually is an index of well-being, which often gets overlooked. I think probably on that measure, we've got some way to go. I spend some time of the year at the moment in Berlin, which is immeasurably superior in terms of all the indices that we've been offering. But I'm not sure I want to live there permanently. There are many, and one reason for that is that the feedback between what the artists are saying, and by artists, as I say, I include this very, very broadly, and what is becoming possible in the urban spaces there is closing down to some extent for a whole set of reasons. Anyway, the challenge, I think, here is to ask ourselves whether or not there is a dialogue going on between our local and regional governments, the planners, the administrative and managerial bureaucracies who are charged with managing risk, for example, and the, if you like, counter-argument that's coming consistently from the creative communities, and we all belong to that, who want to see quality, transformation, inclusiveness, the revitalisation of the stories that make sense of place. All of those things require a certain poise, a certain commitment to quality of life. And it's an open question as to whether or not we actually have that dialogue happening in such a way that one can see tangible changes occurring that make the spaces of the city genuinely enjoyable.
It sounds as though you can create these spaces with a committee, whereas a lot of other people might think that artistic spaces spring up like mushrooms organically. And perhaps that was the failing of Docklands, not to talk about Docklands tonight, but that it hasn't been allowed to be an organic space that would just let
I suppose. Well, okay. Well,
naturally.
I would say a word about. I mean, I suppose having been quite involved with that process, I would say that the issue in that particular part of the city should be sheeted back to a broader question about whether or not we have a culture of urban design. And I put the stress on culture. It's not that we don't have a wide range of people professing urban design. We're very well supplied with designers and planners and architects and very vociferous community groups looking out for the heritage of their neighbourhoods. It's not that we're short of expertise or a really vivid dialogue about what should happen, but that's slightly different from having a culture of urban design which immediately appreciates the importance of these considerations and places them at the top of the list of priorities. And I don't think we do. So whilst we have, as I say, a very vocal and in your case extremely witty critique of developments that by any standard fail the test of urbanity, that's not reflected in the culture. And so there would be another index where I think there's really scope for, not least for the universities, to think seriously about the way they educate. And there's a serious opportunity for the media to offer a slightly more diverse view about what the opportunities are for us, as the actors in the city, to have a more effective voice. And it's not about just objections to change. Of course it's not. In fact, it could be the opposite. It could be, if we're a creative community, it's about how we design change and how we are ourselves involved in those processes. Clearly, those were not considerations, in the context of the way that the Docklands development was procured.
Sorry, Penny.
No, I was going to ask you.
Well, the next, I guess, one of the big next opportunities is this Melbourne Arts Precinct that they released a blueprint for yesterday. Have you had a look at that? What do you think of it? Okay.
I have, but can I just address public art for a second?
Yeah.
Because I think if we are a bit chest beating and proud of the fact that we have our livability status, and our cultural capital status, and I think fair enough, that's fine. We should not be proud of our public art status.
Are you talking about Vault?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the City of Melbourne and public art.
Right.
I'm being that broad. I think that's where I think urban design, generally architecture as a statement within our urban fabric, fantastic. I think we do it very well comparatively. Public art, really way behind. If you're talking about world cities, we're not even on.
How do we do it badly, and how does other people do it well?
Well, I'll give you an example of something we tried, and I'm saying this is great, and that even people who can recognise we've done this. But we worked with, through our curator Max Delaney, we worked with Stuart from Spacecraft. Stuart from
I don't know, but the project
Spacecraft.
Yeah, and we did a project called Flags for Melbourne.
Who was it?
Russell.
Sorry,
Russell.
thank you. So Flags for Melbourne, the idea was actually working with the City of Melbourne and with Spacecraft just to say that what else can public art do? So we invested in 14 flag designs by 14 different artists in Melbourne and actually had those three sets made, one for the Great Hall, one for the artist and one actually, or for the city, and one for public flagpoles right across the city. We've had a ceremony with Trades Hall where we actually move it weekly with a range of new Indigenous designed flags. We've gone into hotels, building sites, the Westgate Bridge. It's just trying to get people to debate, that this is another expression of ephemeral public art that could be, an ongoing dialogue and something that Melbourne could actually claim and wrestle with far more than we are now. As you say, we've got enormous talent or skill in this city. Why aren't we doing a lot more with that as public statements? They don't need to be permanent. They don't have to be bronzes. They can be so many other things. And I just think we really let ourselves down in that regard. And the City of Melbourne were really great in sort of joining with us and sort of saying we endorse that kind of thinking.
Have you got an example for us of a city that's doing it really well?
Well, I sort of think Chicago, Boston, places like that. But cities that are prepared to invest really serious amounts of money into statements or into sort of temporary public art displays. One of the things that I learned from Melbourne Now was that the more we invest in these sort of just profound single statements, the better the impact and the potential international impact for our own artists. We're very reticent to put serious money behind local art, but we'll put big money into international art for a local audience.
Yeah,
you've brought
me to my key question, Tony, and that is Melbourne Now. Okay, huge. Now, we got the big press release about, what was it? You guys had 100,000 people through in the first 2 weeks, which compared to, say, the most successful exhibition of all time at NGV, which was, 380,000 over the whole period. Yep. Is Melbourne Now going to smash that record? Mm-hmm. That's A. And B, if you had taken Melbourne Now to the people with the money and said, we want to put this in the winter slot, what would you have come up against? Would they have said no?
I wouldn't propose it in the first place.
Right.
Because the winter slot's fine, as it is, in my view.
Okay, well, back to the first question then. Okay,
so I'm slightly uncomfortable talking about numbers as a measure, but also the way in which we have to do it for this show, because the entire building encapsulates the show in some form in both buildings. So if you walk in the front door, you're automatically exposed to Melbourne Now. So we count you. So it's not really a fair measure to those exhibitions where you have to go pay for a ticket, walk into the exhibition. However, people want to know numbers. And the only way that we can do it is to say, well, Federation Square X have walked in, and that many have walked into St Kilda Road at this particular time. Currently, we're looking like we've got about 480,000 people have walked through the door. I think what's more interesting is that we're 25% up on last year.
Right.
And I have to attribute the bulk of that to Melbourne Now, if not all of that to Melbourne Now. So it does say if you invest in contemporary art, there is an audience that is really prepared to get behind it. I think our institutions traditionally are the most conservative when it comes to making that kind of claim and taking that kind of risk. Yet our audience is far more progressive than I think we give it credit for. I know when I first proposed this idea, my interstate counterparts thought this was... I had gone too far in terms of sort of making an investment in something this vast on contemporary art, because we had nothing to benchmark it against.
Yeah, that is full on. I mean, I just want to say that's scary stuff, because now what you have done is armed yourself with those numbers as much as you dislike them.
And that was my intention.
Yeah.
I'm doing this for a local audience. That's my aim, is to just say, this is now an example of where we can take creative risks around contemporary culture, art and design. That's the other critical thing, because design was it was 1/3 of that exhibition was the NGV taking on design, not just visual art.
And will the success of Melbourne Now free you in any ways in the future? What will it enable that couldn't have been possible before?
I think genuine collaboration.
Yeah.
This idea of really tapping into the city's talent pool and saying we don't know it all. We've learned so much from working in a genuinely collaborative sense. I know it all sounds sort of very motherhood when people talk about, we're going to collaborate, but we really did collaborate, and we really are going to do a lot more of it.
Yeah. Gosh, there's two ways we could go now, because I'm so interested in this way that art functions in this really mechanised, money-powered way. I think it's fascinating because probably you, Emily, a lot would have to talk about what you do in the sense of economics. Like, I'd love to look into how the government sees the art as a functional part of the city. How would they define the role of art when you're...
Well, I guess perhaps what's important to note is that the National Gallery of Victoria is a state agency, am I right? Sort of founded under an act.
Yep.
And so its remit is to, be a cultural centre for Victorians and in public life. Next Wave is an independent organisation. It says to government, we want to do this. This is our vision. This is who we want to be. We want to be a contemporary arts organisation for Australia based in Melbourne, and we're going to be genre-busting, risk-taking for emerging artists. So we say that is our vision, and we propose the measures based on our vision. So and they're funding us to do that. They're not funding us to achieve, I guess, objectives of the state.
Does that make you feel like you have a bit of a responsibility? I think Next Wave, at least in the past, we talk about the limits that the city imposes, but Next Wave seems to have ignored those to some extent. Next Wave was always the one that was doing something in the weird loading bay underneath Fed Square or in the viaduct and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, Next Wave has said a lot about Melbourne. We've been up the spire over the last, it's our 30th year in 2014. We've been up the spire, we've been under the freeways, we've been in nightclubs, and
we've been in strip clubs.
We've been in strip clubs. We've been in the MCG. In private homes, on the river, in all sorts of places. To the point that after 30 years, I kind of go, well, certainly, the idea of putting art in unusual spaces is. I wouldn't say that's avant-garde anymore. So what artists I see are exploring in a trend, I guess, is to really look at duration and time and really more investigate the relationship with each other, with their audience. More, I guess a critical engagement with space is something that has really been thoroughly explored by artists for a very long time.
You guys are doing time now. I like... What you did last year was risky as far as the Next Wave program went. Next Wave last year changed their program so that you could sign up for a whole day. You wouldn't just go to an exhibition, but you would trust Next Wave enough that you'd sign on, you'd buy a ticket, and they would take you for a day. Yeah. And that was risky at the time, but it was successful, wasn't it?
Yeah, we sort of sold out of all of those opportunities to kind of go from here, actually. We had a breakfast club in which we talk about art in context. Yeah. And people came here and they drank coffee, and then we took them on sort of guided tours throughout the city to visit all the different kinds of forms that our artists were making, and we took them down to the Docklands, and we took them to the Mission to Seafarers, which is this amazing space in sort of at the end of Flinders Street. And we took them up to Northcote, all over the city. And I guess some people very kindly said that it was like a love letter to Melbourne, because you were being taken by the hand and you were a tourist in your own city for a time, and someone had kind of introduced you to their version of this city. We will be doing them again, but we're also sort of shifting it, because that's what I want, to be like a day pass or a night pass or a super pass, which kind of is for superheroes. And so you can just do kind of halves or full.
So people are quite willing to do that. They really will just go out of their comfort zone and not knowing what they're going to be doing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think people are interested in genuine experiences.
Yeah.
You can see something like the Big Day Out I would call it a generic experience of a festival. Yeah. It's not tightly, there isn't a tight curation on it, there isn't a tight vision, whereas I guess a boutique thing that thinks about its audience and its community, like Golden Plains or Meredith Music Festival, are so much more... You have such a deeper relationship with them, so that's what's inspiring us.
Yeah. I must admit, Emma, I was I was like, this isn't going to work.
Well, that means it's probably an interesting idea.
I remember when I started my art column in the first few weeks, and I said to my friend Mel, do you want to come around to the galleries with me today? Because I used to have to go. And she said, do you have to, pay? You don't have to pay, do you? And I was like, no. And she goes, and when you walk in, do you have to say hello to the person who's sitting there? Or can you just, go? And I was like, whoa. That's how some people, that's how intimidated some people are by it.
No, but I think sometimes the problem is that the way, when we think about what is Melbourne as a creative city, we're thinking about it only from our own communities and perspectives. And I think that's often what Oslo or different kinds of good commentators do, is they cut through our either privileged position or our very kind of located position.
Yeah.
Well, I think, if you're talking about cutting through and cities and art, look at what Hobart's done.
Oh, yeah.
And with the massive Mona gallery down there.
I feel as though
which is, what a transformation that has had on the whole state, has been the number one tourist attraction.
Yeah.
And getting Tasmanians to go and see disgusting machines that do disgusting things.
That's right.
What an amazing thing
it really
that is.
ties into, I think, what Tony was just saying, which is the question of why can't we just be a bit bolder and put some big money behind stuff that we know is great? Because we know the audience is going to come and see it, which is what Emily's saying. Tasmania is like a weird, undeliberate example of that, because you've got David Welsh, who's got this enormous amount of money. I don't know if there were any other stakeholders at the beginning at Mona. Did anyone else have a say? Or was it just David who got to do it?
Yeah.
And I wonder, to what degree would it be possible to do a Mona deliberately?
In Melbourne?
Yeah. I don't... Emily, maybe that's too big of a question.
No, I'm just I'm wondering about the conditions that bring about someone to kind of be able to go, I'm just going to do it. I mean,
but a lot of it's to do with the shock of the content, which we actually have in Melbourne every month. But we have it in dislocated areas, but we're actually exposed to that and more all the time.
Yeah.
It's because it's Tasmania. It's so unexpected. Yeah. It's the eccentricity of the architecture, the space, the visitors that go there. That's part of it. To be honest.
Is. I mean, to talk to, we had this amazing female taxi driver the last time that we were in, just recently down for Mona Foma, and she'd never been, but the pride with which she'd observed the building grow, and the way that so many of the locals spoke about the tax man coming to get him, and he was one of ours, and look what there's an immense pride, even if they're not engaging with the art, which is, I guess, bringing back to...
Do you think that people go to Mona, the majority of them go there for the art?
Yeah, I think they do.
Yeah. I went to Mona recently, and they sent a survey then it said this guy is doing a PhD on Mona. Do you want to answer the questions? And essentially his PhD is, why do people go to Mona? And I think it's a valid question, because often you go there and A, after an hour you're exhausted, but B, everyone else is exhausted, and some people are vocally complaining, but and saying that they feel uncomfortable.
It's that role of the current museum, though, that's about the cultural and the social. You go there because it's also about the experience. It's about the audience, it's about the environment, the architecture, the food and wine, and the art.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I feel
the shocking art that the taxi drivers all describe to you on the way there.
Yeah, they do.
And you sit there. You have to sit in the back of a taxi in Tasmania, otherwise you blush the whole trip. I've been told about the toilet to go to,
me too.
Everything.
I think it's okay if people are going to the museum to have a good time, right? That's totally okay.
So that's
it is absolutely okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to talk about Mona too long, but does it have an impact on Hobart as the city?
A huge impact.
I mean, in the sense, will there be a great flowering of artists in Tassie and Hobart in the next 20 years?
There's certainly a great flowering
of
tourism
culturally.
Good question. I don't know.
Well,
or is it just a theme park?
Oslo, you are so controversial.
It's a theme park because it's contemporary art and it's provocative. So if you do contemporary art and you take a risk and invest in it and go with work that's going to also have broad appeal and be debated, it gets accused of being a theme park, which I find that a bit upsetting, because I think contemporary artists end up being the butt of the joke all the time.
Yeah.
But I think if it doesn't, I mean, we don't want art to do X, Y, and Z. But if it exists in this vacuum of, a place where we just, get shocked and then we go back to our, TV shows on Channel 9. I mean, what is the point? But I kind of think that it is verging on theme park, and I must say Melbourne Now doesn't, because it connects with communities and people and artist-run galleries and seems to have a real connection. But the stuff at Mona seems to exist in this Fantasyland art bubble, which is not kind of has any sort of. I enjoy it, but I just don't see it as a connecting thing to a city, like, for example, what we do over here.
I've gone into a thoughtful zone now. We do need to start audience questions, and I think we've just opened a really massive can of worms, which is great. Does anyone have a question on the top of their minds right now? Everyone's too scared. There we go. Thank you. Start things off.
Hi, I'm Barbara. If money wasn't an object, what would be the best thing to do for art in Melbourne?
Ooh. Tony has an answer to this, I saw.
I do, but it does involve money. But I think a third site for the NGV that would be dedicated to contemporary art. I've been saying that every talk I go to. Thank you for the clapping, by the way.
That's great. Does anyone else have it? Paul, do you have any thoughts on that? No money, what would you do?
If money was no object... Oh, that's excellent. Okay.
No object.
Well, if money was no object, I would document, and I use that word carefully, the transformation of a major inner urban environment and produce something that was better. And that would be a huge collective art project. I think you could do it for about... Well, obviously, you have to think about GST and risk management. I would say that, but I reckon about 600 million, you'd get a pretty good result.
Awesome.
And we'd have the public art that we
all
need.
love.
Yeah, we work on it. We all.
Yep.
Anyone else?
Sorry, just to be really boring. I would put in place something that made sure that artists could still actually live in the city, because our real estate is really changing. So I would really like to make sure that people can live here.
But if you had like an art hotel, everyone would want to live there.
No, I want like 70,000 of them. I'm not talking about one art hotel.
How many are you doing down at the so-called precinct?
Yeah. No, but I guess I mean I would want spaces for art in the city that are legitimate and long-standing.
Rent-controlled.
Yeah.
Cool. Do you have any thoughts, Oslo?
Oh, no, I don't.
Would you get rid of any buskers?
Yeah, they have to do a test now, don't they?
No, I don't think
Did they come through?
No. They don't really audition, but they have to demonstrate to the council what they're going to do. And there's not like it's not idle, but they do have to show people what they're going to do.
I mean, it isn't interesting. I mean, it's another question, but it actually is a fascinating question, because the question really isn't, although it sounds like it, it's not about money. It's about governance. In other words, it's about how we translate the sort of the taxes, in a sense, that we generate into effective forms, whether it's public art, whether it's educational programs, all the things that support a creative city, a city that, I see how big Geelong is on that picture in the surrealist map. Well, it would be very interesting to think about smart manufacturing as a legitimate part of an artistic environment. So in other words, it's not simply having a lot of money around. It's a question of how we as a culture prioritise design, artistic practice, and just to sort of say what I said before, I suppose, how that side of the equation achieves an effective dialogue with those who are appointed to prioritise the way the money is spent. So, I mean, that's probably a slightly more sombre aspect to it.
Mm. Anyone else? Oh, there's lots of people now. You guys can ask the hard questions. I checked before. You're allowed to ask anything.
Hi there. I just wanted to go back to the concept of theme park art that Oslo mentioned. And I know it's an incredibly contentious term to use, but I guess it's the most appropriate for the kind of work that you're talking about, which I assume is, work that's kind of big and bombastic and shocking and has that sort of broad appeal. I do think that in terms of, reaching a very broad audience, there is merit to that kind of work. And if you use Mona as an example, you go and see the Fat Car or, Big Worm Man or whatever. But in the same space, there are other less accessible works. For instance, I remember seeing some very tiny arrowheads, prehistoric arrowheads that were placed in the same context, and they were sort of, you see them in a completely new light, and I thought that was incredibly remarkable. And so I guess I do see the merit in that, big punchy stuff. But I was wondering, Oslo, if you think that, that sort of work is problematic, what other strategies you think are good for introducing a broad audience to work that's more accessible and less accessible?
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I don't think theme parks are necessarily a bad thing. I think there can be places where you do discover some amazing stuff. I guess what and other people have said by that reference is that it's existing as a kind of an island and a holiday trip rather than a part of your fabric of life. And we talked about public art before. But I think Melbourne has one of the best examples of this sort of. And you asked about where can people find this stuff elsewhere, and Melbourne has probably one of the best examples for that. 3 nights a week, there's an ARI gallery opening. There's a massive rotation of large exhibitions at the NGV, ACME, at the museum. Big, even our regional galleries are really sort of stepping up and doing some amazing stuff. So it's all around us, and we obviously take it for granted a lot. But with Mona, as everyone says, or some people have said, it does kind of exist in this sort of confined spot.
How do you get people to go to more of the ARI openings? And is that the question? It's more, how can you... I remember I had an editor, and I'm not going to say who it was, but there was a new editor that came on when I was doing art reviews at The Age, and she called me into the office and said, because I'd been pitching a lot of artist-run gallery shows, and she said, from now on, can you please pitch shows that people would actually go to? That was her exact words. Meaning, and I looked at that in retrospect and I realised she meant shows that seem big enough to the readers that it would make sense for them to make a trip into the city and blah, blah, blah. So to me, the question is about how do you make really great stuff seem big? Do you have to take over the marketing department?
There is a bit of a thing about marketing. I've noticed this when it comes to current discussion around art exhibitions in general, with the contemporary art of the winter masterpieces. And there's a national art critic who loves to bring up, whenever particularly it's contemporary art and it's successful, that it's all because of the spin and the marketing. If you're investing $5.8 million into a contemporary art exhibition, you kind of want people to go. And you've funded it, by the way, so we have an obligation for you to go. So you therefore require a group of marketing experts who work for you to, with integrity and in full consultation, create a big campaign. What is wrong with that? In any other business, we would applaud that. In the arts, it's like there's too much hype and marketing around this experience. And I find that a really frustrating sort of contradiction or value-driven sort of statement that isn't fair, and we always apply it to the arts, particularly the visual arts.
Marketing doesn't always work either. Like Melbourne Museum have had some exhibitions that have been promoted to the hilt, and I think they had reasonably low numbers to some of their shows. ACME as well. They have blockbusters, but they have shows that don't work. So
maybe a more interesting example is a Powerhouse Museum in Sydney that, when I was a kid, we went there, it was just part of our lives, but it really, it's just not part of people's psychology in Sydney anymore. And that's a real shame. But they have a new team there now, and I that's where, it's not about marketing, it's about the substance of what's being promoted, really, and if that show is engaging.
Paul?
Just one thing on Mona is that it's a private collection and it's a private entrepreneur. And of course, if you go back in history, they have always been the drivers of certainly a middle class culture. So it's a theme park in the same way that in England Longleat is a theme park, and good on him. What's interesting about it from that point of view is it's a very successful business. That's his game, and it's also exciting. It's erotic because it's one curatorial obsession. It's a certain set of highly ingenious sort of wanderings through fairly gloomy spaces, very Piranesi. So I would have thought that the question about a collection like that is, what is the role that philanthropy plays in the national scene? And there you can make some fairly invidious comparisons with what happens in other countries. So one can discuss, obviously, how David Walsh's business model benefits or fails to benefit, whether it sucks up creativity from the Hobart scene. It clearly brings in the tourist dollar, but who is actually at a political level or a cultural level showing leadership in managing that change? How does it work in relation to jobs disappearing, the transformation of the culture? All of those things are relevant. But as an act as entrepreneurial cultural promotion and self-promotion, it's a private enterprise. It doesn't have the same responsibilities that you have to face, or both of you have to face, and it, in a sense, it gives it a freedom, but it also means that it reminds us, in a certain sense, of the poverty of the philanthropic investment in cultural infrastructure in Australia when you compare it with other countries.
I think we've got time for one last question. Oh, yeah.
My question's based around the fact that Melbourne's a fantastic artistic environment because artists live here and work here, and I think that Melbourne Now is a brilliant example of a collection of artists who do work out of Melbourne. In the whole global marketplace that art is today, people talk about how the best and brightest of most industries do move overseas because there's more opportunity there. Just a two-pronged question. One, do you think there's going to be a point where our artists and our creatives are going to start to decentralise from Melbourne and Australia? And what ways do you believe are the best to keep them here and to continue to nourish the creativity that's happening?
That's a tough one. Thank you.
Well, can I say one way is to exhibit them, publish for them, mentor them, help them with their grant applications. I mean, there's all those things that I think all of us are doing and are always open to doing. And it goes back to, I think, one of the things we said at the very start, which is Melbourne is a very supportive, collaborative space for artists to be in. I genuinely believe that. And I think we all will each other on and do what we can to help propel them to the next level that they aspire towards. I'd like to think that an NGV can actually be seen to be more central to that than I think people have perceived us to be. And I think our staff, and particularly our contemporary art curators, are absolutely committed to making sure that they're seen to be there as contributors to that bigger picture and that bigger opportunity without the artist then feeling compelled to go to another place to produce.
What about you, Em? That's all you do, artistic development.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, we as part of towards the end of the Next Wave Festival, we'll be hosting this international conference for theatre makers, and it's usually held in Europe. And we're hosting one in partnership with the Art Centre and OSCO that's an Asian one. It's, involving people from Europe and Asia. And we are doing, I can't tell you how much work we're doing to make sure, to be good hosts. I guess we're really not assuming that people are interested in us or can afford to get here, can afford to be here when they are here. It is so, we are a long way away, and I guess in the sort of shifts of of coming together closer on the internet, we also have to acknowledge that distance and then be a bit humble about it, I guess, and see what it will take to really be legitimate in our interaction with the world. And that means that when it comes to our closer neighbours that aren't as socio-economically powerful, that we have to be good at reciprocity, and we have to be good at not just going to Indonesia and traipsing through and getting everything that we want out of it. Even as an arts community, we actually have to be good at ensuring people can come here as well, and that we can learn and kind of listen, I guess. We do have enormous wealth in this country, and I guess we just have to carry ourselves well in that and be good hosts if we want not just people to stay, but people to find us a good place to stay, whether they're Australian or anyone else.
Thanks, Em. Yeah. That was such a good... I feel like we've started about 45 discussions tonight, but that was always going to happen. It was so good. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you so much to all our speakers, Oslo, Paul, Emily and Tony.
Thank you.